Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I'm Michael Robinson, the program director at Nccj, and I'd like to start off all of our evening programs by saying thank you for allowing us to stand in between you and your dinner. Or maybe you're having dinner right now, to which I'll say thank you for having us over to dinner for tonight. This is our first ever virtual interfaith experience. So you all here are a part of history. So give yourselves a round of applause for that, for just being a part of history. For years, NCCJ has worked to bring folks from differing perspectives together to build community and celebrate their similarities and differences through events like our Citation Award Dinner, which has highlighted community leaders across the Triad that have worked to make our community a more inclusive place for over 70 years. Our flagship youth leadership program, Anytown, which has helped shape young leaders in the Triad for over 30 years, and the litany of programming that we do in schools and workplaces and across the community today. Many of the folks who are joining us may be familiar with NCCJ as a human relations organization that works across a variety of identity dimensions to build awareness and provide spaces for folks to learn from one another, share their experiences, all in an effort to foster more intentionally inclusive schools, workplaces, and communities. But back before NCCJ focused its work on various intersections of identity and the disparate experiences of individuals, as a result, it was primarily an interfaith organization known as the National Conference for Christians and Jews. There's still some people out in our community who ask, what is they saying for again? Didn't they change the name? Because it was more, for a very long time, it was known as the National Conference of Christians and Jews. And while that work then focused primarily on, was primarily faith-based, the early mission of NCCJ still holds true to the values that we hold today: to build compassionate and just communities free of bias, bigotry, and racism, where justice shall become the standard for human relationships. So tonight, in keeping with the well-established history of NCCJ as a convener of folks from different perspectives, coming together to discuss how they are working towards creating a more perfect union, we've gathered a group of community leaders who work in community and professionally, whose work in community and professionally is guided by principles that are deeply embedded in faith and social justice. With me tonight, Doha Medani
is the Director of Digital Strategy at Muslim Women for, headquartered in Durham, North Carolina. Say hey, Doha. Wave at everybody. We also have Rev CJ Brinson, who is the Faith-Based Engagement Director with NC Black Alliance and serves as youth minister at Genesis Baptist Church here in Greensboro. And Paul Ringel, who is an associate professor of history at High Point University and teaches a variety of courses with a particular focus on race, sports, and popular culture. You can learn more about each of these folks by following the link to our blog post about the event, which will be placed in the chat. As we begin our conversation tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of those that came before us and those who still remain. Many of us are joining the call from the ancestral lands of the Kiawe, Ino, and Sispaha Native tribes, and an area that was home to various bands of the Saponi people. This land, in many cases, was stolen through forced evacuation and genocide, or usurped through broken treaties. It's important for us to acknowledge the place that these people have in the national conversation around equity and inclusion, and especially for the fight of social justice and making our nation a better place. The stories that we often tell around race are not in black and white, they're in full color. And they impact each and every one of us, no matter how and when we enter that narrative in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Tonight, you might be challenged by some of the things that you hear. I've asked the panelists to show up authentically and provide as one of our panelists, Paul mentioned in a meeting we had last week, their unvarnished perspective of the issues and potential solutions to those issues. Now, while it's not our intention to place shame, blame, or guilt, it is our goal to have you think deeply and critically about how the topics we are discussing impact you and those around you. So we ask you tonight to listen deeply, right? Which means that we're setting aside our judgments and we're leaning in with curiosity. We also ask that you listen with open minds and open hearts. These folks are not monolithic representatives of their faith tradition, but rather they're practitioners that are using their faith to guide their work. So we ask you to bring your questions at the end. We're going to have a question and answer session at the end of the session. And we ask you to bring your questions, bring your thoughts, bring your ideas, enter into conversation with us, but do so thoughtfully and in a way that's worthy of the individuals who've asked us, who we've asked to be a part of the conversation tonight. So with that, thank you. We're going to get started. I want to start off the discussion tonight with the lovely folks we've gathered by giving everybody a chance to explain a little bit more about the work that they do. Each individual is doing some type of work that focuses on different aspects of community activism or addressing social need. And so I'm going to start with Doha. And I'm just going to ask you to just talk a little bit about what led to the formation of your organization and how faith and beliefs guide the social justice work that you do in community. And then I'll tag everybody else and we'll go from there. Okay.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you for starting us off with that really important land acknowledgement. I'm Doha. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, actually attending these interfaith tours as a Grimsley High School student. So I'm super excited to be participating tonight. And as you've mentioned, I'm the Director of Digital Strategy for Muslim Women for. And really, it's a fancy way of saying that I do a lot of creating digital spaces for community and coalition building. Muslim Women for is a social justice and political advocacy organization that I co-founded with two other Muslim women, Jaelle and Neema, and they are two of my best friends. And really, the way our organization began originally started as a way for us to create spaces that were inspired by the history and the work and the resilience of Black, Brown, and Muslim women. And we felt that their spaces, both religious and social justice related, left us feeling really devalued and silenced as Muslim women. And so even though we had the intention of primarily creating spaces that showcased the diversity and creativity and nuance that exist among Muslim women, our organization quickly after, we started in 2016, but after the really traumatic and painful Chapel Hill shootings of Dia, Yusr, and Razan being one of my classmates and a friend of mine, our organization really quickly formed into a space for providing necessary political education, leadership development for women and femmes, regardless of their religion or their faith or their world beliefs. And so I think just within the context of our organization starting in 2015, 2016 by college students who felt that there wasn't a space that existed for us, I believe that we've definitely grown, and our mission and our goals have definitely, as the years progressed, become a lot more intentional and a lot more focused in on creating that political education for a community that hasn't really felt ownership in being Americans or even sometimes in their own Muslim identity and practicing their faith in ways that are comfortable for them. So that's a little bit about me and kind of where my work lies. And so thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, Doha. Rev CJ Brinson, introduce yourself, talk a little about the work that you do in NC Black Alliance and with youth here in Greensboro.
So Reverend CJ Brinson, pronouns he, him, his. So happy to be here with all of you tonight. As stated already, I am a faith-based director with the organization NC Black Alliance and youth minister here in Greensboro at Genesis Baptist Church. NC Black Alliance was started over 15 years ago, initially to be a support system for Black elected officials throughout the state. It has evolved, and our work and focus is establishing Black political infrastructure in local Black communities. One of the ways that we seek to do that is through faith-based organizing. And so my role has really been around engaging faith leaders, particularly Black faith leaders throughout the state, making sure that they have the resources that they need to be civically engaged. I got into this work, I'll say I got into organizing really after my experience in seminary. I would say that seminary radicalized me even more. I went to a Black HBCU political science undergrad at the illustrious North Carolina A&T State University, Aggie Pride. Aggie Pride, yes. And some of the political rearing occurred there, but my seminary experience allowed my faith to meet my political ideology and really empowered me in such a way. And I came through at the right time during the BLM movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. And for me, BLM, that movement embodied what we are seeking to achieve in the Christian faith, and that is the gospel that both John and Jesus has proclaimed, which is that the kingdom or the beloved community is at hand. And BLM embodied that. It was so many different pieces of marginalized communities who would come together and to advocate and to demand justice for Black people and Black women and Black queer people, and with the intent of saying that once we heal the most marginalized, we can begin to solve the problems of all of those who are marginalized within our community. And so I was so blessed for that, and it is the reason that I am here before you all tonight.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. And Paul, introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us a little about the work that you do. Community, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Michael, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I'm really glad to be here with everybody tonight. I grew up in suburban Boston and moved down here in 2005 to take a job at High Point University in the history department. I've been teaching there since then, and if Reverend Brinson said that seminary radicalized him, I think that the start of my radicalization was moving down here to North Carolina, because it was very easy to be a white progressive in Boston, and I didn't really have to do a lot. And it became a little bit harder when I moved down here, and you know, I've tried to rise to that challenge. And the reason I'm here tonight is not just because of my work at High Point University, but also because I'm a really deeply involved member at Temple Emmanuel here in Greensboro. And the organization that I'm probably most involved with within the Temple is an immigration subcommittee that works on the Jewish requirement to welcome the stranger. And I don't know if our rabbis are here on the call, but they can tell us the number of times that the Torah tells us to welcome the stranger is something over a dozen. And so I know that, you know, we've been taught by our rabbis that that's one of the most important things that we can do. That organization, and I'm not 100% sure that I'm remembering this right, but I think it came out of a movement with a group of us the morning after the 2016 election, when we woke up and said, okay, we have to do more. And I was with a couple other people who put out a call, and we had about 45 or 50 people who met the next Sunday morning at Temple Emmanuel, and a number of organizations came out of that, and the immigration committee was one of them. And the main thing that we've done is to work with Faith Action International House to partner with local Latino church that used to be called Daystar Espanol, and now I've just blanked on their name. I'm so sorry. I'm blanking on the new name of the church, but we have partnered with them in the Stranger to Neighbor program over the last 3 or 4 years, and it's brought so much richness to our relationship with the community, and I think it's created benefits for both sides. David Fracaro, who's the executive director of Faith Action, says he thinks it's a really almost unprecedented relationship nationally. So I'm happy to be talking about that.
Wonderful, wonderful. You already said so much. I'm so excited about the rest. So, all of the work that you do is an intersection of social justice, faith, you know, and galvanized by, you know, in a lot of cases, traumatic experience, right? Like it's something that it's not, I mean, the long history of trauma, direct trauma, people that you know being impacted by the things the injustices that run rampant in our culture, you know. The last year, you know, with the onset of the pandemic and the calls for justice and redress of various systems across our nation due to the deaths of George Floyd and other BIPOC individuals in our community, has really caused, you know, we're using different words to describe this, you know, a reckoning, right? Which we can describe as sort of just like a calling to appraisal of things, right? Let's figure out how we got here, what's really going on, an awakening, some people are saying, you know, to how the ways that systemic racism really show up in our everyday lives, you know. So I'm interested to know how has the events of the past year, especially related to the death of George Floyd, the social awakening around systemic racism in our communities across the nation, how has that impacted how you show up in your work? You know, are you doing things differently? Are you noticing things you weren't noticing before? Are you adjusting things, redefining, refocusing? What are some things that this past year has really ushered in for you in the work that you do? I'll start with Reverend CJ.
I would say for me, what I've seen in our work is that we are a lot more intentional about prioritizing human life. And that has been my experience in both working with NC Black Alliance as well as working in the church. Within the Alliance, with any nonprofit, folks have numbers and goals that they are trying to achieve. Folks are writing grants and writing plans to receive funding. And a lot of times that can get in the way of really valuing people and really having relationship with folk in a more meaningful way. And the virus made it so that people had to slow down. People had to really, once again, really be concerned about one another, really be open to be in service once again to one another. And so we were able to do that in a meaningful way, in many ways. Feeling in many spaces a need for resources. Like in rural areas, folks may not have had internet or may not have been familiar with Zoom, and they needed Zooms to be able to communicate because they were so used to being able to meet in person. And so we were able to just be able to be there and to fill that void. And then also in the church, we were really intent about pushing, people over profit. We don't need to have Sunday service just so we can raise the tithe and the offering. We don't need to put people's lives in danger. The church is supposed to extend beyond the four walls. So it's a pastor out of Chicago, Reverend Reginald Sharp, who said, the building may be closed, but the church may be open. And so here locally, we were really trying to utilize and adopt that model. And our church remained open in certain ways around our food pantry. And we were able to continue to be a resource for folks in our local community in the east side of Greensboro on Bessemer Avenue. So I would have to lift up really prioritizing people and their health during this time.
Doha, how about you all? How have things shifted and changed in this time?
Definitely. I would say that the biggest thing for Muslim Women for and our organization and us just as folks in the work who originally started a relationship where we're friends first. I think that for us, we realized the real importance of community care. I think a lot of people talk about self-care in the movement, but we realized that so many of our religious practices are communal, whether that's like Friday prayer or, for example, Ramadan, like breaking fast amongst one another, in community with each other. A lot of those things we couldn't do. And for many people in our community, a lot of their, what was really like tying them to our work and what was really tying them to others was seeing other people. And so we realized that we actually are not put on this earth to struggle. And I think our faith keeps us honest and keeps me honest with that. That, as much as we want to create spaces where we can help people, sometimes the best thing that we can do is creating spaces where people can talk to one another or where people can we created community check-ins on Instagram. And for us, that felt like, oh, we're not doing anything. But so many people enjoyed them because they're just like, hey, I'm like just glad that I can come on here and like talk to you all, or I can just come on here and like share about what's going on. And we had invited speakers. So we had people come and talk and share, like, hey, this mosque in this area is doing, so-and-so activity or so-and-so food drive, especially at the very beginning. And now they've been doing them. They've been doing a lot of sharing about, COVID testing sites and things like that. And so I think just really integrating wellness and realizing that the way that we were living prior was unsustainable, in just like the rapid response, the constantly overworking ourselves or feeling like all of the things that we're doing we might not necessarily be seeing the results. I think it really gave a lot of us an opportunity just within Muslim Women For, the opportunity to just like take a breath and really assess the situation. But you also mentioned the kind of reckoning that happened with the deaths of George Floyd and others. And I think that reckoning and that awareness for a lot of our panelists and maybe even some of our attendees happened way prior to 2020. And I think that for a lot of us, but also speaking just for myself, I think that just really assessing where we were and very much like sitting with that was a large part of personally like my kind of like my religious understanding as well, and just knowing that we're not all on the same page, and that's okay. But just recognizing that we're not all on the same page is helpful with moving forward. So definitely a lot of like stillness and reflecting on that, and less, toiling and self blame or hopelessness.
Thank you, Doha. Paul, so you're a professor. You do work with the temple. How has this time that we're in affected how you show up in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you. And like Doha was saying a moment ago, I think 2020 was more of an acceleration than any kind of awakening for me and for the organizations that I've been working with. This has happened for me in stages. Moving to North Carolina, the 2016 election, the Charlottesville events in 2017, which I can come back to at another point if you want, because it doesn't directly connect to what you're asking. What I think 2020 did for me, both through the temple and through the university, is just sort of reemphasize the need for me as a historian to try to develop empathy in the people that I'm working with. And so in both at the university and at the temple, that made me really sort of push myself to bring in new voices that I think weren't being heard before. At school, that meant I had been planning in the spring to teach a class on the history of presidential elections. And I was excited to teach that in the fall. And as soon as the shootings happened, I decided that wasn't what was most important. What was most important was that my students, who were primarily white, needed to be hearing more Black voices in their curriculum and needed to be learning ways to sort of think about how to empathize with those voices. And so I created a class that I called Black American Narratives, which had the students, and I've taught it both semesters this year now. The students have read 7 autobiographies, starting with Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs and ending with Assata Shakur and Barack Obama, and getting students to hear these voices. I remember so clearly last spring, and this was before the shootings, but a bunch of my students didn't even know who Frederick Douglass was. And I said, that's just not okay. You can't be going through my class and not being aware of this history. And so on the university level, I've been trying to make sure that we integrate far more Black voices into our curriculum, at least in my classes in the department. And the same thing in the temple. And what I've been trying to do there is work with colleagues and community members to get us thinking about Black voices. One of the things, our first instinct was to reach out and get lots of Black American speakers. And my reaction to that was, well, it's not their job to teach us until we've done the work ourselves first. And so I think it was really important for us to, have discussions and read books, and, people kind of made jokes about the book clubs and for valid reasons. But I think getting people to start thinking about empathy for people who are different than you are, that's the way to start. And then you can bring in other voices and let them be heard. But we don't want to ask them to do that until we've done our work ourselves.
I appreciate that very much. Talk about shifting, right? You're every one of you speaks to this idea of how both of these things happening at the same time, right? So, we have our whole world is sort of upset by the pandemic. And then, what a lot of people feel, that was the perfect container for what we saw happening in the summer, right? That people could all focus on something, on one thing, as opposed to being sort of distracted by the various things we would be doing in a normal, late May, early June, in our spaces. Paul, you mentioned starting off with, history of presidential elections, being that we just had a recent a shift in an administration, when some people are still maybe feeling many different ways about, let's just say that. As we end the 4 years that we've spent with the last administration, we're some ways into the first 100 days of our new administration in Washington. Many people that I've come into contact with have said that the last 4 years have been some of the most divisive years that we've experienced as a community and as a nation. There are people who are losing friends they've had for decades. Some of the elders in our community who were part of what we, as 90s and early 2000s kids were learning about the struggles that they went through in the civil rights movement and things like this. We're calling this time that we're in right now more dangerous than what they experienced, and for some people, they even feel like we've taken steps backwards in our quest for that more perfect union that I mentioned earlier in the program. We just saw earlier in January a failed insurrection, trying to overturn the results of a legitimate election. So with all of this, we're still hanging on. People are getting vaccinated, but coronavirus is shifting and changing. So who knows? We have a new administration, but I think we're feeling still fractured. People are still, we're not standing on solid ice, as it were. So I'm interested from your personal and professional perspective, being people who are committed to doing this work out in community, but also guided through your own personal beliefs, personal values. What do you think it will take for our nation and our community to heal and transform the divisions that seem to be tearing us apart? Who do you think needs to be involved in that kind of healing process? What kind of mindset do we need to embody? What place does the church and the temple and the mosque and the rest of community coming together? What place do we all have in that healing process? I'll start again with I'm going to start with Doha this time. Actually, Doha, I want you to see what do you think?
It's such an interesting question, because when I think about healing, and my perspective of healing and has really changed, I think, in the past couple of years. And what I'm learning about healing and harm is that we're human beings. We're going to harm each other. And I think Islam definitely has a lot of instances in terms of Islamic tradition where, harm is discussed, and how do you reconcile with people? How do you create justice when we harm each other? And I think that actually, I know that Islamic tradition is very clear about reconciliation and about social justice, and it's weaved in the fabric of our religious practice, the religious actions that we're supposed to take. And I think that for me, post 2020, looking at kind of like where we are now, it's really become about how you move in the world. And long before, I believed that the burden of racism and injustice isn't meant to be carried by the people that are experiencing it, in the same way that the burden of poverty and the systems that create poverty are not just the problem of poor folks, right? And I think that until folks recognize that and truly take accountability, and the folks that created situations and the people that benefit from it decide that they're not going to allow it to continue, I think that's when we begin to truly reconcile. I think that there are lots of calls for reconciliation and healing when there's only been words and there haven't been any actions. And I think that true meaningful action and true changes are long overdue. And again, I think that in the same way, I personally believe that equity and social justice are weaved in the fabric of, my religious and like personal practice. I think it needs to be weaved in the fabric of our society, and equity needs to be involved in every decision that we're making. I think we also have to just move beyond this idea that we're gonna I think it's great that, and Paul, we've talked about this before. I think it's great that, we're reading books about, or reading books written by Black folks or Muslims or Natives or Indigenous folks. But at the same time, it's still shocking when people are like, oh, I am just, finding out who this person is in college, And I think that we have to start being really critical about the decisions that we're making and the society we're creating, moving forward. But I think in the same way that we're going to continue to harm people, we also have to continue healing people and creating space to really sit with that. And I think the last thing that I was thinking about while you were talking is that I don't think any of us can go back to the way that we were living, because it truly was unsustainable in every aspect of the word unsustainable. And I think that if I truly believe in justice the way I claim to, I can't continue to live my life the way I was prior, because that existence was going to reach a breaking point, and it did. And I think that just in general, for me personally, that starts with my own people. I'm Muslim, right? But I'm also Sudanese, I'm also African, but I have folks in my Muslim community who don't know the full story of Muslims in America. And when I say that, I'm talking about enslaved Africans and their forced contributions to building this country, right? And so it's as much as it's my duty to educate and to involve them in understanding that and understanding what it means to be an American, to be an immigrant, other folks of other, cultures, of other backgrounds living in this country also have to have that same reckoning with their own folks, and for it to be constant and often, and not just a one-time thing, but truly ingrained in how we decide we want to show up in the world. And I don't think people want to hear that because it's tiring and it's exhausting, but I think that's the only way we can move forward.
Snaps. Reverend Brinson, what are your thoughts on what do we need to heal? How do we transform what we have going on in our community to get everybody to kumbaya and all that good stuff?
I'm afraid to follow after Doha. I hope I have something of substance.
Yes, you do. Go ahead, Rev.
To provide some brevity to this conversation. I think it's going to be similar to what Doha has raised. I think that the most marginalized communities and the benefactors of oppression have to be involved in this process. There needs to be some acknowledgement and there needs to be some acceptance around what is happening in our country. I would push back a little bit and say, I don't know if this period is the most divisive when I look throughout history. A bit tumultuous, yes. A little more tumultuous than what we've been used to in our contemporary history, yes. But when you take into account our history and the formation of our history, and the oppression of many marginalized communities. I can't say that it is the most divisive, and I can't allow us to scapegoat. I can say his name now, Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a result of a broken system. And so the acknowledgement that we have a broken system and that we have to do some work around healing and fixing our broken system. And as Doha said, that centers around atonement and not so much reconciliation. Everyone wants to get towards listening and reconciling as opposed to atonement. And I think atonement looks like really asking the question, what needs to be done to protect the most vulnerable in our society, and then putting those actions into place. I think politically, so it looks like policy in that regard, but it may look like a certain level of standards or a certain model of ethics that need to be applied within society. We get stuck at action. The same folks who will speak out against racism during a George Floyd incident will be the same folks who won't be for transitioning funds from police budgets to park and recreation budgets in their city. The same folks who will say, I run with Ahmad, will be the same folks undermining police reform efforts within the community. And people take these things lightly, but there is an urgency that a lot of folks who are marginalized and oppressed that they feel. And so in order for us to really begin to bring some resolve around these issues, we have to take these things seriously, and we have to really be about getting to the action. If that looks like making sure that we have equitable, and I'll speak to some of the issues here in Greensboro, but if that looks like getting to equitable distribution of city contracts to minority and women businesses in this city, those are the things that need to begin to happen. These are 40-year-old issues. It's not just something that started under the Trump era. Before Trump, North Carolina didn't do the best job of funding and fully funding education. And so it's easy for us to scapegoat those things to this period. But I think to do so would be, it would be disingenuous, and it would also do us grave harm, and also perpetuate a cycle of inaction that we need to be more serious about addressing.
Thank you, Reverend Brinson. Paul, what do you think? How do we heal this thing?
All right, you're gonna make me go after that, huh?
I am. I sure am. I didn't
think I wanted to go after Doha. Now I definitely don't want to go. All right, so let me start with a couple of the things that they said, and I will build on that. First, what Doha said about reading is not sufficient. That's obviously true, and we need to think about action. And I've been thinking a lot about what does action look like. And then what Reverend CJ said about atonement, that's a word that has a ton of meaning in the Jewish faith, right? We have our Day of Atonement. And what does it mean to atone? Well, I have two kids who, do things wrong. We all do things wrong and say they're sorry. And I always tell them, okay, just remember, sorry doesn't mean, you're sorry that you're sorry that it happened. It means you're going to try to change your behavior and make sure it doesn't happen again. So what does that mean for white people who want to be allies in this process, and for white people who've reaped the benefits of the structural advantages for generations, whether our families were slaveholders or not? It doesn't matter that my family wasn't living in the South when slavery happened. You know, my family still has benefited from generations of advantages that families of color didn't have. To me, what atonement means for me personally is listening to people of color and not just saying, "Whoa, defund the police." That's too much, man. That's a bad political slogan. But listening to why, before I say yes, no, or maybe, why is that something that's important to you? And listening to the voices that aren't getting heard. It also means partnering with people to try to do more education. Both of you talked about education, and you know, two of the projects that I'm working on right now are moving away from writing books for adults to doing projects for younger people, because I think we have to change the way our children get educated in this country. We have to put stories in front of them and get them thinking critically, and you know, thinking that American history doesn't mean just honoring the past, it means investigating the past. And so, you know, one of the things that I'm incredibly concerned about that's just come up in the last few weeks, as they've been talking about social studies standards, something that means, yeah, is deeply important to me. And there's been this great debate over social studies standards on the North Carolina Board of Education. And ultimately the decision that they came to remove the word systemic from the teaching of racism. They said we can teach racism, but we can't teach systemic racism. We can teach discrimination, but we can't teach gender discrimination. And one of the members of the board, I read this just this morning, and I couldn't believe it. She was talking about gender being biology, and I'm like, what? How can you believe that the gender isn't something that's structured by society and be part of the Board of Education? You know, I've got so many things exploding in my head, but what I will say in terms of healing, and then maybe I'll just stop and we can continue the conversation. I think healing and reconciling means there are certain, for me at least, it means there are certain views that are not acceptable. There are certain views that are not okay. People are not going to base their arguments or their beliefs in actual facts or evidence or any level of compassion or empathy, then I'm not really looking to heal with those people. I want to work with the people who want to show empathy to each other. And if those people want to change their minds, they'll always be welcome back. But there are certain people that, you know, this just refusal to look at the true outcome of the election, or, you know, all of these factual, you know, post-factual debates. I'm just not interested in being part of that. And I don't think that's productive. And so I think part of the way we heal is we turn away from that and try to reach out to the people who are willing to build this kind of beloved community that people have been talking about earlier today. So many other ideas, but I'll stop there.
Thank you all so much. So much. A lot of great things to chew on there. And so, as you mentioned, you know, it's no secret that there's a lot that needs to change, a lot that needs to be transformed for everyone to have an experience that where we're not simply surviving, right? But we're thriving. That, as Doha said, we're not put here to suffer. But folks, depending on a number of different things, socioeconomic status, their race, their gender identity, what have you, are suffering, but because of the system that we have, and have been maintaining, right? This broken system, perhaps, as Reverend Brinson mentioned. Sociologist Elise Boulding, in a 2003 interview, described a framework of thinking about change that she called a 200-year present. And I'm gonna read a quote from her. She says that the 200-year present began 100 years ago with the year of the birth of the people who have reached their 100th birthday today. So happy birthday, those folks. The other boundary of the 200-year present 100 years from now is the 100th birthday of the babies born today. Happy birthday. If you take that span, you and I will have had contact with a lot of people from different parts of that span. So think in terms of events over that span and realize how long change takes. You can see how difficult it has been to create these bodies in new ways, and how in many ways we are slipping backward, but in other ways we are not. So before we go into the Q&A from the audience, and audience members, if you have questions that you've been holding on to, we encourage you to place them into the Q&A portal or into the chat. We'll also give you the opportunity to raise your hand and voice your question to the panelists if you'd rather do that. But I want to ask this final question to the panelists. With this idea in mind, is 200-year present, right? Touching a lot of lives. We're considering what came before us. We're considering the future that we want to see for the babies born today, for our children. You know, some of us on the call have young people in our lives. Many people on the call, I'm sure, do as well. So what is something that you hope the next generation can look back on and say that we did now that contributes to their world being a more fair and just society? Something that they might say that we did to make the world a better place, and what might we need to do in increments to make that happen? I'll start with Paul, and then I'll tag everybody else in. So Paul, what do you think?
You were going to ask me to go first because I hadn't yet. I think, you know, if the most immediate thing that comes to mind is dealing with our issues of climate change. And because if we don't deal with our climate change issues, I don't know what the world's going to look like on the 100th birthday of the kids who were born today. But in terms of a systemic, something that'll last for 100 years, I mean, the one that's been on my mind lately so much is just making systemic changes to the way we make decisions about policy and about voting that bring us back to a world where you know, the majority can make decisions, and we don't have to have a 65-75% or even more approval to get anything done. I mean, I'm been thinking about the filibuster this week, and I'm reading a book about talking about how after the Newtown shootings, and those happened when I had a first grader at the year of the Newtown shooting. So that's something that still hits me incredibly hard. That we had 90% approval for gun control reforms in this country and couldn't get it done because of systemic change or because of systemic gridlock. And so I think the decidedly unsexy answer to this is that we have to change the systems and allow the voices of the majority to be heard, along with, you know, not just the voices of the rich and the corporate and the powerful. And so I think building new systems, or not new systems, but adapting our systems to let other voices be heard is what's going to make the biggest difference for 100 years down the road.
Thank you, Paul. Doha.
Piggybacking off of what Paul said a little bit, I'm not entirely opposed to new systems. And I think that in general, it feels daunting, honestly, when you ask questions like that. And it does feel a little bit hopeless at times when you think about it so far in advance. And I think in a small way, in the smallest of ways, I'd like to hope that we can look back and say that we chose difficult conversations when we could have chosen ease, or that we disrupted and kind of agitated and created, again, difficulty in places that could have been comfortable, or when we could have, you know, maybe accepted the status quo. But I also think, just from the time that I was first born until now, I think a lot has changed in the realm of accepting one's like worth and one's fullness, especially as a Black person. And I think just rejecting the systems that tell us, or the, you know, the messaging that tells us that we're not worthy, or we're not worthy of rest, or we're not worthy of love or care, or like gentleness or kindness. But also when you ask that question, I think of one of my friends, DraShonta. She has this kind of quote that she says, and I don't know who she got it from. She might have stolen it from someone, so I apologize. But she always says that organizers are romantics because we want a world that has more love and acceptance than the one that we grew up in. And I think it kind of builds off of Angela Davis's whole like living with a radical imagination, and being really radical about how you envision the world. And so I'd like to hope that the world that we envision today is one that future generations can see. And yeah, I think I also, when I think that far in advance, I also just default to my faith, and trusting, you know, that Allah, like God's will, is what will prevail, and that will, you know, lean towards justice, and that I just play a very small role in that. But even though that role is small, it's still really important. And so again, I think agitating and disrupting as much as possible, and maybe building new systems and new ways of doing things, because that's the way it's currently working isn't working. So why not, you know?
And why not? Why not? I love that. Reverend Brinson.
I think I'm going to build off of what Doha was saying. One of the pivotal moments in the scriptures in the New Testament is Jesus turning over tables in the temple. And so I guess I'll say, although the methods of the millennials have not always been receptive in our society, what I'm going to be proud about is that this was a generation that sought to change systematic ills on every front, and tried to make the world a lot more accepting and affirming is the word, affirming of all those who found the world less affirming. And so to that, I think that is something that I can be proud for. This was supposed to be a generation who many people wrote off. It was the hip hop generation. It was the video game generation. So many negative things, but yes, it's the generation that has had such profound impact. You have a president now who's speaking about systematic racism, and it may just be rhetoric, but just to say those things, I think, are so powerful, especially from a person who had a history of supporting policies at one point that were in alignment with segregation. And so it just speaks to where we are and the potential to where we have to go. But I think it's also in acknowledging that even though we may not have liked all of the ways in which change occurred, these things were necessary. And I think that's something I'm going to be proud about. And like Doha said, I'm all for new systems. I'm all for recreating a new world. And yes, Pepe Le Pew cannot come, is not welcome in that new space, or any other thing that can be seen or may have contributed to a society in which we could disregard others and didn't even have to hold it or wrestle with it in any meaningful ways.
Thank you all so much. This has been a phenomenal conversation. Thank you so much for all your insight, for the things that I think people can take away from this experience, right? Knowing that we still have so much more work to do, but we still have hope, right? There are people, and these are just 3 individuals in our community who are doing work day in and day out to ensure that that future that Boulding talks about is possible, right? This idea that we can have a better way, that we can see the promised land and we can reach it, you know. So we're going to transition into our Q&A portion of the program, give you all an opportunity to have some of the questions that you had that came up through the presentation answered by the panelists. I'm going to ask Maria, my colleague, the program manager at Nccj, to join us to lead us through some of the questions that folks have asked in the chat and in the Q&A portal here tonight.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We've got some good questions in the Q&A section. And I'm going to start with the first one. So to what extent are you involved in interfaith efforts in your work? What are some key criterion for effective interfaith social justice initiatives?
I can answer it from my perspective. So Muslim Women for prior to coronavirus, we hosted these Ramadan, essentially they're like Ramadan iftars. And so we would break our fast with anyone from the community who wants to come and break their fast with us. And I believe that the way that we do these, we did them at the Lighthouse Project in downtown Raleigh. The way we did them is we had very much all of the questions and all of the engagement was very much real and honest conversations, primarily around not only the way we as a community, as a Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina community are interacting and working with one another, but also the ways in which we aren't working with one another and the ways that we aren't talking with one another, and making sure that we're doing those forms of engagement outside of, fun Ramadan, interfaith events where, we get to eat and we get to talk, but really moving the conversation beyond, we pray 5 times a day, or we do this, or we do that. And that, that kind of sharing is fantastic and very much necessary. But for us, it was more so a social justice space where we can talk about the issues where we're in alignment. And I think especially for Muslims, Ramadan is a time of reflection and a time to really engage with what we're, what are we doing on this earth? And how can we kind of move our work and our purpose into something that's more intentional. And so in the past, people really enjoyed those. And I hope that, we'll continue to do them virtually. We didn't last year. So I think kind of really determining where the baseline is and what kind of conversations are you going to have in an interfaith space and how we can work together beyond the kind of the concept of interfaith. I think, and working on other things and building coalition and working together on other projects. So that's us and what Muslim Women for does, or has done, I guess.
Paul, Reverend Brinson, would you like to respond to that question?
CJ, do you want to go? You want me to go first? Okay. Well, the group that I've been working with in the temple, the immigration subcommittee, the basis of the stranger to neighbor program that we've been working on with Faith Action is to not just have sort of one-time interactions with faith groups, but to build sort of sustained relationships between those groups, and just to sort of build that kind of, I used that word empathy before, but build that kind of collective empathy and on some level of understanding between groups that maybe don't spend a lot of time together. And so the best example of this is one that I talked about in our discussion last week, which was, I guess, 2 years ago, the morning of the shooting at the Pittsburgh synagogue, when I had been, I was in Temple Emanuel that morning watching one of my daughter's best friends become bat mitzvah. And we had already planned that afternoon that we were going to have an event with Daystar Espanol. And we decided to go through the event, even though some of us weren't really feeling up to it. And it was right before the midterm elections in 2018. And if you remember, that was also the time when there was all the sort of hyperbolic propaganda about the immigrant caravans that were coming up from Honduras and Guatemala, and all the dangers of what was happening there. And so our friends were going through a similar feeling of trauma. And what happened that day was we went and met with them. And I remembered it's Definition Church. I apologize that I didn't remember the name before. But we went to Definition Church that afternoon, and we just sort of sat with each other and talked about how each of the groups were feeling, and you know, the trauma that both groups were experiencing. And it became this way of strengthening the relationships. Now, this isn't just a kumbaya movement where everything's okay and everything's fixed, but building those kinds of methods of structures, systems, we keep talking about systems, structures of reciprocal support, where, you know, it's not just, you know, here come the allies to help, but we build these relationships where the sides are helping each other to build kind of new structures that can work for all of us.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Paul. Reverend Brinson.
Yes. So our faith-based program is fairly new. We're still building it as we are driving this ship, so to speak. And although because I'm a reverend and in the Christian church, our engagement has been with a lot of pastors and preachers of the Christian faith. But I think our work is seeking to shift a little bit around engaging other faith communities as well. And I do have to inform folks that we intently seek to work with Black faith leaders when we consider historically what has happened around engaging our folk around certain issues. So that is our focus, but we have been working intently this year to engage Black faith leaders across the faith spectrum, whether that be Black faith leaders who are Muslim, Black faith leaders who are Jewish as well. So that has been our goal. And as I stated before, we seek to be a resource to those leaders, to empower them to be able to be civically engaged, to challenge them around theological perspectives. We are seeking to work against this radical religious right conservatism that is seeped into our religion, and that has stifled so many movements that were involved around social change. And we see that we have to have as many voices at the table, and it just can't be the voice of those who call themselves Christian. We believe that all are children of the Most High. And so we have been doing work to make sure that we are intentional about making sure all of those voices are present in our conversation as well as in our work.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. Maria, what's next up on our Q&A list?
Yeah, we've got some good questions here. Thank you all for your thoughtful answers. I really like this question, so I'm going to pick it next. So have you ever experienced someone that you care about disagreeing with the work that you do? If so, how did you handle that situation?
I'll go first if that's permitted. I haven't had anyone necessarily disagree with my work. I've had my grandmother over the last 10 years coming from the space in which she comes from, during a time where so much of how they showed up in the world was around being cautious and conservative, and really in a frank way, if I must say, prove themselves to larger white society. She would always say to me, "You need to be careful so you won't lose your job," or "You need to make sure you're not doing things that's going to hinder you from getting a job." And that came from a place of fear and really her wanting to have my best interests in place. Earlier in my days when I was getting arrested with NAACP for Moral Mondays, or whether I was getting arrested here in Greensboro around a gentleman named Jose Charles, a young person, a young African-American Hispanic teenager who was assaulted by police, or whether I've been involved in Marcus Deion Smith's campaigns. She has had a healthy fear, but I've always assured her that this is my work, this is my calling, and somehow God will make a way. And I believe that has given her some peace around being able to handle the work that I am involved in. But that's been my experience as being challenged and faced with caution.
Thank you, Reverend Brinson. Paul and Doha, any experience with this question that you'd like to share?
Doha, do you want to go? You want me to go?
Oh, no, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, this has come up for me in a couple of different ways. Fortunately, I don't have members of my immediate family who are part of this kind of right-wing, post-factual, insurrectionist cause. I do have some members, a lot of members actually in my extended family, who at first, several years back, I tried to have debates with, and honestly, at this point, I have sort of separated myself from mostly. I do get challenged sometimes by friends who are white progressives or white moderates about pushing on different issues or I've been challenged a few times about bringing certain speakers to campus. I've become friends with pastor in High Point, Brad Lilly, who was a former member of the would still call himself a member of the Black Panthers, but was the leader of the Panthers in High Point in the early 70s. And I've brought him to campus to speak about his experiences, and have gotten some pushback from students sometimes on that. But I feel okay about that because I feel like, Doha talked about, you didn't use the John Lewis words of good trouble, I guess, but stirring up the trouble, I mean, that's what I'm supposed to be doing, especially now that I'm a more senior faculty member. That's why I have the status that I have. I mean, if I'm not using that to challenge established thinking, then I don't really think that I'm doing my job.
So great, thank you. What's the next question?
Thank you. So this one, I'm sure that you've had to think about a lot in the past year, especially, but how do you maintain your health mentally and physically while doing the work that you do?
If anyone has the answer to that question, please put it in the chat. I'd love to know. I mean, I don't know. I think for me, I'm just like figuring it out as I go. I think it's definitely a blessing to be physically healthy and mentally healthy. And it's something that I don't take, for granted. But I would say, honestly, I personally have struggled with my mental and physical health a lot this past year or last year. And I think, again, the biggest thing for me, I said it earlier, but I'll say it again. And I think it's more so just letting myself hear it, is that, I don't believe any of us are put on this earth to suffer. And I believe that Allah loves us all, and that we can, we actually have this verse in the Quran that God won't burden a soul beyond, or God won't burden a soul except what it can handle. And knowing that everything that you have been tasked with dealing with are things that God knows you can deal with and that you can get through. But I think another part of it is not organizing or not doing work, and trying to create this work to build this world that you want to live in. That's just going to harm you, because if you're harming yourself by trying to create these things, then you're creating a world that's going to harm you, if that makes sense. Or don't organize in a way that's going to kill you, kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know the answer. I think I'm trying to figure it out day by day. But I think at the very beginning of it is self-care and community care and checking in, especially me with like my parents, and having family time and reminding myself of why I'm doing what I'm doing. And it's faith, and it's also my family and my friends. So, and Paul and CJ.
As Doha has said, I don't know if there is one method. The first thing I would say is counseling, and more counseling, and really doing the work of healing. When I got into organizing, my ego would drive me so much to just always want to be engaged, and service. And if you do that, you will burn out. You have to also know that there are others who are here who can do this work as well. And so I have some books that I've been reading for my personal healing. Iyanla Vanzant, Acts of Faith. It's a meditation that goes on daily. And then I'm going to dive into another book, My Grandmother's Hands, by a gentleman named Resma Matik, who talks about racial trauma and how that is carried on generational, but probably how all traumas that we are experiencing, whether it be patriarchal trauma or some other form of trauma that has been present within our existence, that oppression seems to seep its way through. We have to begin to do that work of addressing it and facing it and working to heal, so that we don't pass these traumas on to other people. That's what I believe. That's what my counseling has led me to believe. And I'm not perfect. Still doing a great work. My counselor says to me, this is not a dumping session. If you want to come here, you have to do work. And so although it's hard, I have to do a lot of work because what we do personally is going to affect how we show up in public spaces. And my wife is really, really big on me about this. She's like, you're perfect in public, but you got some stuff to work on in private. And so I'm constantly trying to work on that private person. And I wear it on my sleeve because I know, although people may not say it, all of us have that struggle as well. And so I want to make folks comfortable about having real conversations about the work around healing. So I think that's all I'll share with you all. Thank you.
I had to turn the volume down for that one, Reverend Brinson, because you're right. Everybody can work on that.
Yeah, I have a lot to add to that. I mean, I think a lot of what Reverend CJ said sort of applies to me as well. Very, very much of that. I was going to say therapy, exercise, community, taking breaks, but honestly, also doing stuff like this, being with other people who are having these same kinds of struggles and these same kind of ideas, and meeting new people and having new conversations. It helps, right? When I go back to my dark place, I feel like I've got a few more people in there with me now, but yeah, I don't think I have anything revolutionary to add beyond that, so I'll stop.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. And like I said in the chat, everybody pick up a book, My Grandmother's Hands, Rhythm Minicum. It's beautiful. It's amazing. It really is deep stuff. Maria, next question.
Yeah, I've got another one here ready. So what you kind of touched on this a little bit while you were in dialogue earlier on, but what advice would you give a young person that is trying to think of ways to give back to their community and engage in social justice issues?
Oh, so sorry about that, Paul. When I think about this question, I also think back to like when I was younger, which I'm still very young, but we're all young. But I think that when I think of that question and I think of who I look to, most of the time it was people that were already in my circle, people who I went to school with, professors, just anyone who I honestly thought was interesting, or I thought was doing something interesting. Even just among this group here and the panelists here, there's like 4 or 5 organizations, reach out to us after this conversation. I'd like to think that we have a closeness and kind of that we've created a bit of community. And so I think just like not overcomplicating it, and just like people love to talk about themselves. I learned one of my professors in school would always say that professors love to talk about themselves and the things that they do. So just ask people what they do and they'll talk to you. And so I think just like starting there and thinking about what are people doing around you that excites you, and kind of like plugging into that. So Paul, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I was going to say you should go first because I think you're the youngest of us, but I was just going to say, don't reinvent the wheel. There are lots of people doing amazing things out there already. So do what Doha said, go around and talk to people. Reverend CJ talked about Guildford for All. That's a great place to look. Talk to any of us, talk to, I say put yourself in different places. Go to places, go to groups you're not used to going to, meet new people. But I think that Doha's recommendation of sort of following people you admire and listening to them and talking to them, because if you have an idea, chances are much of it's been done before, and we don't want to waste the time and effort by rebuilding something and having 6 or 7 examples of same thing. That too much of that happens already. And so yeah.
I'd just say, as Doha has already mentioned, find out where the work is happening. And I put organizations down here in the chat, Beloved Community Center, NCCJ, Guildford for All, North Carolina NAACP, Democracy NC, Forward Justice. There are so many organizations that are doing work, and some of the work you may feel is stagnant, or you may feel that it's not exciting, but it's a good opportunity for you to just be involved, get immersed in the language, get immersed with the culture, as you will move on into other spaces that may, for a spell or a season, seem to be more exciting. As my colleagues have said, find out where the work is happening, and put your hand to the plow and get to the work about being involved in social change and social transformation in our community.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. You all have enriched, I believe, everybody on the call with your comments, your insights. This has really been an exceptional evening spent with 3 dynamic individuals. Are there any, before we send everybody off to the rest of their evening. Is there anything that any of our panelists would like to share? Any initiatives or any final words before we part ways this evening?
I was really glad to be a part of this space, and in general, I think that conversations like these, I'm so glad that they're happening, and I'm so glad that, you know, as much as this COVID era that we're in has really been difficult, and on many days, you know, I feel like nothing that I'm doing is working and everything's going wrong. When I have conversations like these, I think, you know, this conversation might not have been able to have happened in this way. And for many people with this much ease, you know, in terms of just logging in on the computer. So I'm just really glad to have been a part of this, and thank you for inviting me. And I'm so glad I met Paul and Reverend CJ through this as well.
Thank you, Doha. The benefits of one of the many benefits of the coronavirus is that we get to do things like this.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you also. And, you know, I was really grateful to be with all the people on the call. And I hope this is the start of longer conversations and longer relationships and partnerships. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation continuing.
Thank you. Thank you.
I am just so happy and honored and thrilled to be here with all of you. I'm so blessed that the table was served in such a way for us to be able to be our authentic selves, to be able to have some real input around some real serious and challenging things in society, and to be able to hear from various different voices around how we need to address those things. So I'm honored to be here. I feel like a crossover artist. I'm in new space, and I hope that I was able to represent well. But I'm just really just thrilled to be here with the esteemed panelists, and also the esteemed host, Brother Michael Robinson, as well as Sister Maria. So thank you all for inviting me again.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for accepting the call, and the call that you have accepted, and the work that you do for our community to make it a better place. Folks that are joining us, thank you all so much for spending this time with us this evening. I hope that you have been enriched as much as I have by the conversation, and inspired by the work that these folks are doing and the words they had to share with us. We have another event in our Interfaith Program series on March the 25th. It's called Faith and Social Justice. We're bringing together a group of faith leaders from across the triad to have them talk a little bit about how this moment that we are in as a nation and as a community has impacted the work that they're doing personally and across their memberships and their congregation, and what they, again, as we talked about a little bit tonight, what they see as a way forward for us all in an interfaith sense, coming together to make a way for transformation and the atonement that we all must be a part of in order to heal what we have, the brokenness that we have before us. So please join us. There's a link in the chat to register for that event. Let a friend know. Thank you all so much again for your time. And I hope that you all have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful evening, rest of the weekend. Enjoy the weather, and stay hardened. Be blessed. You all have a beautiful evening. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.